Amen. Well, while you're getting something out to take notes on, let me, excuse me, let me just spill my heart to you for a second. A couple of weeks ago, I was reading an article posted by a guy that I've come to admire and read a lot of his stuff, and he was talking about how right now in America, there's an unprecedented event taking place, and that is with the number of pastors that are leaving ministry. It has put churches in a very bad way because pastors are becoming discouraged. They're becoming overwhelmed by all that's going on, and as a result, instead of staying and sticking it out, they're just getting out of ministry altogether. And I was thinking about that in relationship to our church, and I thought, we are so blessed in our church. As pastors, I can't tell you enough what a blessing you are to us. You let us be human. You let us make mistakes along the way. You've allowed us to learn and to grow and to develop. And you haven't stood around the corner waiting on one of us to make a mistake so you can jump out and scream at us. Certainly that has happened on occasions, but thankfully that's the exception and not the rule. And I can't express to you enough how grateful I am for your encouragement, for your support. I can't tell you how much it means to have people just pause and say, you know what, we appreciate what you're doing. I really do. I'm afraid that I don't follow that personally closely enough. I don't extend my appreciation to you as often as I should. And so I want to do that now, just to let you know it's not overlooked. We don't take it for granted. We may not say it often enough, but we definitely appreciate you. You are such a blessing to us. Jeff, would you add a little more bass into my mic? Maybe a whole lot of bass. With that thought being fresh on our minds, let me tell you what we're going to be studying today. Never stop. Now, certainly it's not the direction of our study, but let me add this in. Never stop doing that, please. We need it. We desperately need it. We don't want to become a statistic later on down the road. We want to keep going for the glory of God, and you're a big part of why we're able to do that. Thank you for that. But with the title in mind, let me get into where we're heading now. As we look through the book of Joshua and we study the different events for the children of Israel that took place, one of the things we can come to realize is that God was continually teaching them. And God would give them instructions on something, and He would direct their lives, and the children of Israel would sometimes follow that very closely, and at other times they would just kind of pull away and forget about it, and they would end up in trouble. There are a couple occasions when we come to chapters 8 through 14 where we see this particular thing taking place. That God has given clear direction to the children of Israel, and yet they just seem to kind of tend to fall away from that direction. In such a very clear-cut way, I think God is not only directing their hearts to something specific, but I think also directing our hearts to that as well. I think God wants very much for us to learn the lessons that the children of Israel did not learn. And so for at least one more week, we find ourselves back in the book of Joshua. We may or may not get back there again next week. I'm not really sure. Jason Sneed dropped a couple of thoughts on me over the past couple of weeks regarding previous studies that has really got my wheels turning. One of the blessings for me as pastor is watching you develop, getting to grow with you and to mature with you. And one of the ways I see that happening is when you get more involved in the messages. Now, I do mean paying attention, taking notes, things like that. That really encourages a speaker. It's really helpful for us. But beyond that, when you start coming up and saying, hey, here's what God showed me while you were talking, I love that. I really do love that. The reason we're studying what we're studying today is because last Sunday after the early service, Jerry Duncan came up and shared something with me. And when we get to point number 3, you're going to get to see that. But what he shared with me comes out in point number 3, but is actually the cause of the whole study. It just got me thinking. One of the reasons I'm not sure we'll be back in the book of Joshua next week is because Terry Street dropped an outline on me that I can't wait to get into. I mean, I'm very much excited about it, so I'm kind of torn 3 different directions of where we're going to go next week. And in fact, it's actually 4 or 5 directions, because our last 2 nights in equipping classes, the study got so deep. There were so many thoughts coming out in the study that I'm very anxious to share that information with you as well. So I don't know where we're going to end up. You just pray for me that God will give clarity in thinking about it. But today we come back to this thought of never stop. Never stop. There are 3 things I want you to see that I believe God was teaching the children of Israel and in return teaching us as well. It begins right here. If you're taking notes, jot this down. Number 1, never stop seeking God. Never stop seeking God. I want to go through a little bit of review where we've been to bring us up to where we find ourselves in chapter 8. It's very important that you kind of get the flow of what's taking place here. Okay, you remember the children of Israel finally got entrance into the promised land. God's allowed them to go in after 40 plus years wandering around out in the wilderness. God now allows them to come in. He has them to sanctify themselves, to purify themselves, to make themselves ready for the battle that is coming. He gives them clear direction on how they will fight this battle, and then He sends them to Jericho. They do exactly what God tells them, and amazingly, the walls of Jericho collapse. They really haven't done anything other than march around the wall and shout, and God brings the walls down. Somehow, even though this is clearly a battle that belonged to God, even though this is clearly God's working here, somehow the children of Israel get a little bit prideful over what took place. They begin to see this as an event that somehow they have conjured up, somehow they have manipulated and worked. And instead of giving glory to God, what happens is this pride kind of wells up inside of them. I don't know to what extent it's there, but it seems that it's there. And as a result, when they come time to go to their next battle, the battle of Ai, instead of going through the same process of purification, getting ready for this battle, seeking God's will for the battle, they determine this is such a small thing, we can handle it all by ourselves. We don't really need to seek God. Now, I don't know to what extent that entered into their mind. Maybe it was they just didn't think about it. But for whatever reason, the children of Israel did not seek God in this situation. They went to battle and something awful happened. A battle that they should have won easily, they found themselves running from for their lives. And in fact, 30-something of their warriors were killed as they were fleeing from the city of Ai. Tragic event. Joshua and the elders came back. They fell on their faces before God, and they cried out, God, why did this happen? Oh, that we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan where it was safe. And you remember how God so gently talked to Joshua. Get up, Joshua. Joshua, if you had fallen on your face before me before you went to battle, you really wouldn't have the necessity and the need you have right now to fall on your face after. Had you purified yourself beforehand, you would have found that there was a problem that existed beforehand. Had you sought my direction and will for this battle, you would have found me telling you don't go to battle because there's sin in the camp. You've got to deal with this sin first. But you didn't do that. You decided you could handle this on your own, and we see how that turned out. The children of Israel now back up, and God says, you got to deal with this sin. You got to get it out of the camp, or else I'm not going to help you. The children of Israel did exactly what God told them. They dealt with the sin. They removed it from the camp. Then they sought the will of God. God, how do you want us to go about this battle? God laid it out for them. They went to battle. They had a great victory over their enemies. They did exactly what God told them to do. And now they've come back to their camp, and what do you expect them to do? I believe we find them doing exactly what they should have done. Let me read a little bit of the story to you. Verses 30 and the first part of 31 of Joshua chapter 8. Then we'll read verses 34 and 35. Then Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal. He followed the commands that Moses, the Lord's servant, had written in the book of instruction. Drop down now, 34 and 35. Joshua then read to them all the blessings and curses Moses had written in the book of instructions. Every word of every command that Moses had given was read to the entire assembly of Israel. Let's stop right there. So here's what's happening. They come back from this victory. All of a sudden, they understand this wasn't us. This was God. We saw what happened when we tried to do it on our own. It wasn't very successful. And in fact, if God had not been for us, we could not have defeated the enemy. And they come back and they offer sacrifice. They literally stop to give God worship and glory. Thank you, God, for what you've done. It's exactly what they should have done. And then, to go a little bit further, Joshua says, I don't want you to just try to remember what Moses told us on behalf of God, the commandments of God. What he said would happen if you obey my commandments, what he said would happen if you disobey my commandments, the blessings and the curses that were associated. I want you to go beyond just your memory, because you were just kids back when Moses was telling us that stuff. You were probably less than 20 years old, and so I want to have it read to us, every single word. I don't know how long that would have taken, but the people stood there and they listened. They absorbed what Joshua was having read to them, commandments of God. And in the commandments of God, one of the commandments that they read, one of the things that God had delivered to the children of Israel was when God said, when you go into the promised land, you have a responsibility to drive out the inhabitants of that land before you. Those people are so wicked. Their wickedness has come up before me, and it's time for them to be removed from this land because I've given you that land. And if you do not remove them from the land, their wickedness will infect you to the point that you will eventually turn your back on me and you will go to worshiping other gods. And you can rest assured, if that happens, it will bring devastation upon you as a people. Children of Israel heard this. They heard the commandment of God. They knew exactly what God had laid out for them to do. One would expect then, when the next situation would arise, that they would be quick to listen to God, quick to seek His will. Let's find out if that is the case. Let's continue reading now. We come to chapter 9, verses 3 through 6. Then we'll drop down and read a little further. When the people of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to deception to save themselves. They sent ambassadors to Joshua, loading their donkeys with weathered saddlebags and old patched wineskins. They put on worn-out patched sandals and ragged clothes. And the bread they took with them was dry and moldy. When they arrived at the camp of Israel at Gilgal, they told Joshua and the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant land to ask you to make a peace treaty with us." Okay, so here's the situation. God told them, anybody inside the land of Canaan, you cannot make a treaty with them. Don't do it. They'll turn your hearts away from me. You've got to drive them out of the land. But anybody on the outside of Canaan that wishes to make a treaty with you, if they're willing to open their gates to you when you come up to them, then they can come out and they can serve you and everything will be fine. So now we have people who have heard about Joshua, have heard about how God has interacted with the nation of Israel. And they've heard about the destruction of the city of Jericho and the city of Ai, and they are scared for their lives. They want nothing to do with this group of people. And so instead of trying to battle them, which they know it's a losing measure for them, there's no way they can win, they decide to, by deception, draw them into a treaty. You see, Israel was told you can make treaties with people outside, but none on the inside, so why don't we just act like we're from the outside? So they doctored themselves up with ragged clothes. Looks like they've been traveling for weeks, and their bread was all moldy. We made this fresh out of the oven before we left, and you can see it's gone bad now. You can tell how long we've been traveling. For the children of Israel, one could understand how they would be soaked into that. It would be easy for them to be drawn into such a deceptive behavior. But because they had just gone through what they went through in Ai, they had just experienced not being in the will of the Lord. They had just experienced overshadowing God's purpose and God's plan and doing it themselves in their own way, in their own plan. And they saw the destruction that brought about. And then they saw, when they turned their hearts back to God, they sought God, they saw exactly how God blessed them with great victory. With that in mind, and if what they just heard is Joshua had the commandments of God read to them, one would think that they would pause and say, okay, that looks good to us. It makes sense to us. It's okay for us to make a treaty with people on the outside of Canaan. So we're pretty much inclined to do that, but we're going to check with God first. We do that in everything now. And they would have gone to God and said, God, this makes sense to us. It looks logical. We can see that their clothes are worn out. Their bread is worn out. And so we're going to make a treaty with them unless you direct us otherwise. God, what do you desire for this? And God would have clearly laid out for them, those people are deceiving you. They are not who they say to be. They're not from where they say they're from. Do not make a treaty with those people. Okay. So is that what happened? Read with me now verses 14 through 17 of Joshua 9. So the Israelites examined their food, but they did not consult the Lord. Let's read that again. So the Israelites examined their food, but they did not consult the Lord. Then Joshua made a peace treaty with them and guaranteed their safety. The leaders of the community ratified their agreement with a binding oath. 3 days after making the treaty, they learned that the people actually lived nearby. The Israelites set out at once to investigate and reached their town in 3 days. Uh-oh. They had just walked through this same path. They had just traveled this exact road in Ai. And here they are doing it again. You know, we can shake our heads in disbelief. What were they thinking? I mean, that's just not logical. And yet, aren't we guilty of the same thing? I mean, God has blessed our lives, and God has worked through us and for us in many different ways. And we definitely want God involved when there's big things on the horizon, when there's difficulties or problems approaching, or we're in the middle of a storm. We definitely want God's will. We're seeking Him. But in the little things, not so much. Not such a big deal. Maybe it's like the children of Israel. We just forget about it. We just don't think about it. We're just not programmed like that. I mean, we're self-sufficient people, and therefore if we can take care of it, we take care of it. Maybe it's even worse than that. Maybe it's that we know that what we're wanting to do is not something that's going to line up with God's will, and therefore we know He's going to tell us to do something else, and we don't want to hear it. And therefore, we're just not going to check with Him. That's the way to avoid it. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your might, all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. All your ways. It's not that it says in those really big things, acknowledge God or recognize the authority of God. Or it's not that He says, well, when you really get into a mess, then you better be recognizing who God is, acknowledging His authority and His greatness, and really checking with Him then. No. In fact, the directive in the book of Proverbs is in all your ways, in everything you do. All your ways, acknowledge the greatness of God, and He will direct your path. It's scary to think that I am so good at figuring out my own way. Oh, you're the pastor, you don't do that. Yeah, I'm the pastor, but I guarantee you I do that. I'm just not programmed to think that way, I guess. I'm programmed to think of being my own person, being self-reliant. And how often I can look back and say, oh, well, I wish I'd done that differently. How often I can recognize that had I just been obedient, had I just been seeking God, I wouldn't have run into the same issues, the same problems, the same complications, the same hurts. Things would have gone quite differently. Maybe you're better than that. I hope you are. Or maybe you just need a reminder that this is really important. Number 2. He says, never stop seeking God, and then he says, never stop trusting God. Never stop trusting God. We started our study in chapter 1. We were looking around verse 9, verses that preceded and fell after that. These are verses that have really been significant in my life through the years. Verses in which God has used quite often to teach me different things, to help me, to grow me, to equip me. And in the process of studying this, one of the things I saw in chapter 1 and verse 9 is God laying it out to Joshua. Joshua, my servant Moses is now dead. You're the man. You're the one that's going to take these people into the promised land. And I can imagine the intimidation on Joshua's part. God, are you sure about this? I mean, Moses was the one you talked face to face with. God, I just don't see what I bring to the table. I don't see how I can lead a people like this, and 2 or 3 million people. I don't see that I'm equipped to accomplish such a task. And Joshua, no doubt, had a great deal of intimidation and fear in his life over what was about to come. And God comes to Joshua in chapter 1 and verse 9. He says, Joshua, this is my commandment. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged. Now, it's interesting because God doesn't say, Joshua, I want to tell you something that will really help you along the way. And so I want to encourage you to think about this, and I want to encourage you to step out and do it when the time's right. No. But God, in fact, says, Joshua, I'm going to give you a commandment. I want you to be strong and courageous. I don't want you to be afraid or discouraged. You say, you can't tell someone not to be afraid. You can't tell someone not to be discouraged. And yet you can if 2 things are present. Number 1, you're God. And number two, you give a sufficient explanation as to why there's no need to be afraid. Does God do that for Joshua? He sure does. Notice the end of verse 9. He says, "For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." Now that's pretty significant. That's pretty important, because what he's saying is, Joshua, you're going to be facing a lot of enemies when you get into this land. You're going to start battling a lot of big, sufficiently equipped armies that are going to be able to overwhelm you. But here's what you need to know. They won't overwhelm you as long as you're seeking me and following me and trusting me, because I am always with you. Joshua, I'm bigger than your enemy. I'm bigger than your problems. I'm bigger than your difficulties. I'm bigger than those that want to bring you down. Joshua, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. Now I can imagine that would have been a great comfort to Joshua, and certainly it should have been. And I can imagine that as he went to battle against Jericho, he may not have understood the plan that God had laid out. We're going to walk around the city. We're going to scream. That's your plan for fighting this battle? And yet he trusted God. Why? Because God had said, Joshua, I am going to be with you. So Joshua just did, okay, guys, here's what we're going to do. This plan's not very logical from a human perspective, but this is what God says to do, and this is what we're going to do. And they did, and had incredible results. Wow, the walls caved in. Joshua had experienced the goodness of God. They then bypass the will of God. They go to Ai to do it themselves, and they get routed. They come back, and they get everything confessed and straightened out. And then we come to chapter 8 and verse 1, when once again God has to come back, and the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid or discouraged. Joshua, you've forgotten something very important. I am with you. And then we come to chapter 10 and verse 8, when it says, do not be afraid of them, the Lord said to Joshua, for I have given you victory. Joshua 11 verse 6, then the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them. By this time tomorrow I'll hand them all over to you as dead men. Joshua had a way of forgetting that which was so vital. God is with me. And you know what? I think we come to the same place in our lives. I really do. I think we can be so intimidated by people. We can be so intimidated by situations, when the truth is there is never a need for us to be afraid. Never. We should be able to walk into a room that's filled with our enemies and not be afraid. Why? Because the one that's with us is greater than the one that's with them. There's no need to be afraid. We should not be afraid to share Jesus Christ with anyone, regardless of how intimidating they may appear. Why? Because the one that's with us is far greater than the one that's with them. We shouldn't be afraid to walk into an apparently dangerous situation. If we're seeking God and following His plan and trusting Him, we shouldn't be afraid. Why? Because the one that's walking with us is the one that's greater than anything we will encounter. There's no need to fear. There's no need to be afraid. Think about the fear in your life. What is it that brings the most fear into your life? Take a second. Think about it. Some of the guys are sitting, I don't have any fears. Man, I'm proud of you. Wish I was like you. What is it that brings fear into your life? There's no need to be afraid. God is with you if you're His child and you're seeking Him. He says, trust me. I'm working for your good and for my glory, and I will always accomplish my will. No need to be afraid, because I am with you. Number 3. Never stop seeking God. Never stop trusting God. Never stop serving God. We run across 2 incredible people. Now, there was a number of incredible people among the children of Israel, but 2 in particular in the story of Joshua and his leadership. One is Joshua himself, and the other is a guy named Caleb. These 2 guys, you may remember, were 2 of the original 12 spies that went into the land of Canaan under Moses' leadership. They had just left Egypt. It spent 6-7 days getting to the promised land. They're on the other side of the Jordan River. They're getting ready to cross in, and Moses calls out 12 men. He says, I want you to go into the land, spy it out, come back and tell us how we'll go in and take care of it. 10 of those men come back and said, you're not going to believe it, but there's giants in that land. I mean, these were massive people. Giants in the land. We can't take that land. The cities are well fortified. There is nothing we have that can overcome them. We might as well give up and head back into the wilderness. But 2 of the men, 2 of those spies came back, Joshua and Caleb, and said, oh yes, we can take it. God has given us this land. Let's go in and possess it. Let's take care of business. Children of Israel hated them for that opinion. They wanted to stone them on the spot. Now, God wouldn't allow that. But here we find some 45 years later, God had told the children of Israel, because you've rebelled against me, you will not go into that land I've promised you. In fact, everyone that's 20 years and older right now at the time of this rebellion will die in the wilderness. You'll never see the promised land. So for the next 40 years, they marched around Mount Sinai until every one of them had died with the exception of 2, Joshua and Caleb. Now we find that Caleb comes to Joshua. And we have the story listed, verses 6 on down, but I want to pick up at the end of verse 6, where Joshua says, remember what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, about you and me. Caleb is saying this. Remember what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, about you and me when we were at Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me to Kadesh Barnea to explore the land of Canaan. I returned and gave an honest report, but my brothers who went with me frightened the people from entering the promised land. For my part, I wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. So that day Moses solemnly promised, the land of Canaan on which you were just walking will be your grant of land and that of your descendants forever, because you wholeheartedly followed the Lord your God. Now as you see, and I want you to pay attention to this next part, Caleb is talking, and he's going to, with surprise in his voice, lay out for Joshua something that's really amazing. Listen to this. Now, as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive and well as he promised for all these 45 years since Moses made this promise, even while Israel wandered in the wilderness. Today, I am 85 years old. Now, you just stop and think about that for a minute. Caleb is getting ready to request permission to go do something that people my age and older just wouldn't necessarily want to request permission to go do. And maybe even some younger than me, maybe 40s and 30s, you may not want the opportunity to do this either. Some of you pretty gung-ho, you may want to, but here he's getting ready to do something at the age of 85 that most of us would think, no way, no way. Listen to what he says. Verse 11. I am as strong now as I was when Moses sent me on that journey. I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. So give me the hill country that the Lord promised me. You will remember that as scouts we found the descendants of Anak, the giants living there in great walled towns. Okay, let's pause for just a second. He's asking Joshua for permission to go and fight these giants. Not the smaller cities in the valley, but he's wanting to go up into the mountain where the giants live. I want you to tell me it's okay to go. Most of us would never in a million years request permission to do that. But here's what Caleb says, the end of verse 12. But if the Lord is with me, I will drive them out of the land, just as the Lord said. The Lord is with me. I'm really interested by that because Caleb is at an age where most people would be saying, man, just step back, take it easy. Let somebody else do it now. What age is that? Maybe that age is 40 for you. Maybe it's 50. Maybe it's 60, 70, 80, 90, whatever. And yet I love what Caleb was saying. God's not done with me yet. There's a whole lot more for me to do. I'm not stopping. I'm not stopping. I'm not quitting. In fact, my faith and my trust is so great in God, and I have sought His will in this matter to the extent that I'm willing to go do what most people consider to be impossible. I'm willing to go fight those people that caused us not to go in the first place, even at age 85. I'm not stopping. I thought about our church, thought about us individually, how God has given us so much to do as a church. And the neat thing is that God equips each of us differently. God gives you abilities that He's not given me, and He gives me abilities that He's not given you. And He expects for each of us to use the abilities that He's given to us in order to unify, to grow, and to reach out into the community. God's given us those expectations. Never stop serving. That's not to say that the role of our service doesn't change. I can assure you that at my age, I could not keep up with the teenagers anymore. My mind says, oh, yes, you can. My body just laughs at me. You can forget that. I would love to have the energy to be able to do that. But my role has changed. God's given me a different way to serve now. It's not the same as it used to be. The role may change, but the necessity to serve does not. We can't come to the place where we get content with what we've done in the past. You say, but your younger people are coming in, they're changing some things. It's okay. They need desperately for you to encourage them. They need desperately for you to show them that there's never a time to stop. They need desperately, and it doesn't matter if you're 40 or 50 or 60 or above, at whatever age you are, there's never a time for us to stop. We've got to lay down an example for the younger generations that the work of God continues regardless of what age we are. While our role and our function may change, our necessity to serve never will. Never will. Within a few weeks, Jason and I were laying this out this past week. There's going to be in the back of the auditorium, back in the lobby area, a board that has the different areas of service that are needed for our church family. It'll have a place and a person for you to contact either through email or phone, however you desire to do that. And the person that's in charge will start leading you into ministry. Will help you, equip you, prepare you. We cannot stop now. There's too much at stake. Future of our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids is on the line. We can't stop. We've got to serve. We've got to seek. And we've got to trust. So what do you say? I've done my part now. It's your turn. What are you going to do with this information? Going to sit on it? You're going to own it. Your call.